Good afternoon, 8x1. I hope you're doing well. Obviously, this is not how we wanted to meet after the holiday period, but because of the pandemic and our third lockdown, this is the way we have to do it. So, we are going to continue our studies as best we can through remote learning. Not every lesson will be pre-recorded like this. I hope I'll be able to do a few live lessons with you as well. And then sometimes I'll just be setting work for you through Teams. But there we are. So today we're going to begin something new. You already started it with your lesson earlier this week, where we are going to be studying some war poetry and also some techniques of rhetoric. Rhetoric being the art, the skill of how you influence and persuade people, which of course is what war poetry is often about, to try and persuade people, convince people that war is either a good thing or a bad thing. So today we're going to begin with the first of our poems, and it's a sonnet, so it's building on the work that you would have started earlier this week. Okay, you can see here at the beginning of our new unit on war poetry and rhetoric. We're going to begin with this fine chap here, Rupert Brooke, who wrote a rather famous poem about the war. Many of these poems you'll find come from World War I, which produced some of the greatest or most controversial or most talked and written about poetry that involves war. But as we progress, I'm hoping we'll have time to look at some more contemporary war poetry. Not just World War II, but far more recent conflicts, as we're seeing in Syria, in different parts of Africa, even across Eastern and Western Europe. But for now, let's turn to the first of our poems that we'll be studying by Rupert Brooke. The first poem that we're going to look at by Rupert Brooke is called The Soldier, and you can follow along in the worksheet that you'll find on Teams. As well, as we're reading this, try and consider this idea of rhetoric. Is this a poem that is trying to convince you that war is good, that war is bad, that war is something that we should be willing to go to, whether it is good or bad to be a soldier, and what other things maybe it's trying to convince you of. Well, for now, let's read the poem together. The Soldier. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam. A body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think, this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the internal mind, no less gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends, and gentleness in hearts at peace under an English heaven. Okay, so now that we've read the poem, we're going to turn to some questions about it. And as I walk you through this poem and talk you through this poem, you're going to try and make some annotations. Now, how you do this will be up to you. If you're working digitally in a Word document, you can type up your notes as you go along. If you've printed off the poem and you're working on paper, that's great as well. You can make the notes around the words of the poem, annotating it and sort of explaining some of the bits that we're going to look at today. So it's up to you how you choose to annotate this poem, but you will want to make some notes about the poem based on what I'm going to say over the next few minutes. Okay, we're going to begin with a little bit of context, just a tiny bit. Context is the world around something that you read or watch or listen to. In this case, we're looking just a little bit at the history around this poem and the world and where it was at when the poet wrote it. Now, Rupert Brooke, wrote this poem in 1914, and this is a war poem. So if I were to ask you what is happening in the world, or very specifically in Europe, at this time, hopefully what comes to mind is World War One. Now 1914 is at the beginning of the war. Okay, the war is just starting. Now, the first question here is how and why might it have been a different poem written later? If you consider what people knew about the war in 1914 at the beginning of the war compared to what they knew about it towards the end of the war, well, people's attitudes changed. Some people's attitudes changed quite a bit. In 1914, at the start, there was a lot of optimism, there was a lot of excitement even at this idea of, especially for young men, being able to prove themselves in conflict, of England being this powerful nation that would head out into the conflict and that it would be over extremely quickly. It'd be a short, quick war, and then everyone would be home by Christmas, and that a lot of young men would find their manhood, their identity in the early parts of this war. Of course, as the war went on, people realized very quickly that it was horrible, it was horrific, and it was going to be a very long war, and that many of the people who came home did not come home as heroes or as powerful young men who discovered who they were. They came home horribly damaged psychologically and physically by the war, if they came home at all. As you can see in the picture, there are many graves or graveyards scattered across Western Europe where soldiers were buried, often without knowing who they were even. Okay, and then we turn to the form and structure of the poem. Now, this poem is written as a sonnet. Now, in your previous lesson, I asked you to have a go at writing your own sonnet and gave you some of the elements of a sonnet. The sonnet is a very old form, most famous in England because of the sonnets of William Shakespeare, but even he was adapting the form from someone who came before him, a man called Petrarch. We don't need to worry about that. The key elements of a sonnet, or what makes a sonnet, is this. So first, it has a set number of lines, 14 lines. These will be organized in different ways depending on the sonnet. It also follows a very set way of rhyming. This will change from sonnet to sonnet, but you always want to be looking to see how the poem is set up to rhyme. Generally, it has 10 beats or 10 syllables per line. And the subject of a sonnet tends to be about love, or the flip side of hate. So if you think about that, 14 lines, a very specific way of rhyming, 10 beats or syllables per line, and a topic or a subject that somehow involves love. Is Rupert Brooke's, is this poem, The Soldier, a sonnet? Well, if we go over to the poem here, let's have a look at how it's been structured. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There should be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed. Does it rhyme? Well, we can look at me on the first line and be on the third line. Those two rhyme. Field and concealed in the second and fourth line rhyme. And the second part of that. A dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam. A body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by the sons of home. And again, we've got aware and air, those two words rhyme, and Rome and home, both those rhyme. Now let's count out the beats. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field. Each line has got 10 beats or 10 syllables. So that seems to match up with a sonnet as well. There are 14 lines of the poem. And then finally, that topic, this idea of love. Is this a poem that seems to be showing a love for something? And what do you think that might be, if it is? Okay, now let's have a quick look at just two small parts of the poem where we might look at the language that the poem is using. So you can see the two questions here. You've got this on your worksheet as well, which hopefully you're able to access through Teams. If I switch back to the poem, okay, we go here. On the third and fourth line. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed. What does he mean by that? Well, let's go back to the beginning of the poem and read down to this point. If I should die, think only this of me. Colon. Now, colons usually set up an explanation or a list. In this case, it's an explanation. What's the explanation? That there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. So the poet, or the narrator in this poem, is saying, if I die in this war as a soldier, if I die somewhere in a foreign field, somewhere abroad, in the land, in the ground, there's going to be a piece of England there. That piece of field will be made English. Why? Well, it's implying because the soldier will be buried there. Okay, so that foreign place will be transformed from French or Belgian or German or whatever nation into a piece of English soil. How does that happen? Well, it's because there shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed. So what is the dust? Well, the dust is the soldier. It's a bit of a biblical reference. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Okay, it goes all the way back to the beginning of the Bible, to Genesis, when Adam is described as having come up from the dust and given life by God. So we return to that dust. The soldier is a dust in the ground of this foreign land. And he makes that rich earth. So it's almost complementing the earth of the foreign fields of this faraway place. But the dust of the soldier is even richer. It's even greater. And why is that dust greater, better than the soil that it's buried under? I think the answer comes in the next 4 lines. It's a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware. It's an English dust. So there's a real pride in this. The soldier is an English soldier, and he brings some of that Englishness with him wherever he goes. And when he dies, he transforms that land into a little bit of England as well. Okay, we're now going to look at the second stanza of the poem and see what that adds to the overall story or narrative of this poem. After all, the poem begins with, if I should die, which tells us that the soldier is not dead. The narrator is alive, telling us this poem. And the soldier's view of the consequence of his death, or how we should think about his death, should that happen somewhere abroad. If we turn to the poem itself, we can see that when he dies, he says you just need to think of this, and how he will transform a piece of land into something that's a bit more English. But we get on to the second stanza, which is a bit more challenging. Let me just reread it quickly. And think this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind, no less gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given. her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, in laughter learnt of friends, and gentleness in hearts at peace under an English heaven. The key part of this stanza to understand is that second line, a pulse in the eternal mind. What do you think the narrator or the poet means by the eternal mind? What mind could possibly be eternal? And what would a pulse in that mind be? Well, my interpretation of this would be that the eternal mind is nothing less than God. And so we're getting a very religious image here. Now that's no surprise, because earlier in talking about dust, the religious imagery was already there. So he seems to be suggesting here, the narrator, the soldier, seems to be saying, don't worry if I die, because in death I return to being a pulse in the eternal mind. I return to God. I return to God's creation. And what happens once he's within this sort of spiritual realm, with back in the embrace of God? Well, all the good things of life return to him. So those dreams, the laughter, the friendship, the gentleness. And of course, this heaven is then situated back in England. So the poem seems to be saying, or the narrator seems to be saying, that I'm going to war, I may die. If I do die, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because not only will I be transforming something abroad into something English, but my death itself will bring me back home into a happier state. The final question I would leave with you is, whatever the narrator is saying, whatever the soldier is saying, is this what the poet believes? And that's a much more difficult question. The fact that it's placed in 1914 suggests something a bit naive about the war itself. At the same time, this could be a heavily ironic poem, and is Rupert Brooke sending up this kind of view or this mentality? And that is a much more difficult question that we're not going to look at today. Okay, now we're going to jump ahead to the last part I want you to consider in this, which is, why did the poet write this poem? Okay, what do you think this poem is trying to say? And how is the poet trying to convince readers? Why is the poet trying to convince readers of anything? And you're going to try and write a paragraph here, but without the typo that I've put in here. So it's not the soldier, but the soldier. Okay. In the soldier, Brooke is trying to convince the reader that, and this is a really tricky question, and you're trying to bring back together all the earlier stuff that we looked at pretty quickly. So for example, he's writing this in 1914 at the beginning of the war. How does this poem make people feel about the war? How does this poem make people feel about England? England gets mentioned quite a bit in the poem. Why is that? If the poet or the narrator feels very proud about his country and about England and England's involvement in the war, what is he trying to tell the reader? Is it trying to inspire them, or is it trying to warn them? Is it trying to convince people that the war is a good thing to go to? Or is it trying to convince the reader that war is a bad thing? Do we get any actual description of the war? Do we get anything that tells us what war is really like in this poem? And why or why not? So that's quite a bit. Try to write a sentence or two that finishes off this paragraph that I've started. Okay? There's no wrong answers here. Give it your best effort. Okay, and that's going to be it for today's lesson. What I need you to do, year 8, is to try and answer all the questions on the worksheet to the best of your ability. Hopefully some of what I've walked you through in the poem will help you answer that. The main thing you want to take away from this lesson is, what is a sonnet? Okay? And if you're able to do that, can you maybe bring this back to the work you started last lesson in which you were writing your own sonnet. Okay? We're going to continue looking at different war poems, but we're going to start shifting a little bit away from the war poems themselves so much as what they're trying to do and how they try and convince us of some ideas. What details or descriptions or language or structure do they use to convince people of an idea or of an argument? Because these poems, at a very difficult time in world history, had very strong messages that they were trying to get across to their readers and to their listeners. Keep safe, keep healthy, and I hope to see you in the classroom at some point in the future.